Welcome to the Classroom Café, where it's all about brewing the conversation between fellow educators. This special presentation is brought to you by the United Federation of Teachers and the union's Member Assistance Program. Thank you for joining us today. We hope this podcast inspires you, nourishes you, and motivates you. Now let's get started. Hello again, and thank you for joining us for another episode of the Classroom Café podcast. I'm Selma Williams, and I'm here with our co-host, Janice Acosta.
Hi, I'm Janice Acosta, social worker and substance use liaison with the UFT's Member Assistance Program.
Today, we have a few special guests. We are joined by Ashley Groesbeck. Ashley is a clinical social worker and psychotherapist in the good old New York City. We're also joined by Alain Metellus.
You're here with Alain Metellus, Director of Crisis Intervention for United Federation of Teachers, as well as working with the MAP program.
So Alain, can you tell us a little bit about the things that you're seeing in the field, right? Because you're out there involved with every borough, right? And on a daily basis. So what are some of the themes that you're seeing overall?
So as everyone's aware, we are nearing our end, thankfully, of a pandemic that we've experienced an enormous amount of loss. A lot of mental illness has come out of this pandemic, and folks that are still managing to pick up the pieces after losses of loved ones, and also managing within the new space that we're in, whether you've lost your job, whether or not your teacher is no longer back in the school anymore, whether or not I just shared a story with a member the other day where their kid was on remote for 2 years and transitioning back to high schools, a lot of angst amongst our members with anxieties, with different workspaces that they're now in, different tasks they're asked, and teachers who are teaching out of license areas. Folks that are still dealing with grief and loss of coworkers that might have passed away in the last 2 years, as well as their own personal losses. So as I travel the city, I respond to losses all over New York City. I also spend time with the MAP program facilitating a grief and loss group once a week for 4 weeks. So that has been a challenge for us. I think the best thing that came out of the pandemic, personally for me, is to see how many folks have reached out for mental health support. We were usually begging our society to take mental health as a priority and as something that is part of like getting up and brushing your teeth, is to focus on mental health and to think about how much emotional balance directs our lives and puts us in a good space. So I really, really, really have noticed that people are reaching out. We're matching folks through MAP with mental health support outside of MAP so that they can get long-term support. So I find that to be very rewarding.
Awesome. And Ashley, you recently did a presentation for us about collective grief and ambiguous loss. Can you just begin to talk a little bit about that, if you don't mind?
Sure. I can talk a lot about that. Just to in case you didn't watch the presentation, collective grief is framed around the idea it's when a community goes through a pretty profound event together. And typically it's an event that we would say has more negative consequences. So you're thinking about things often like natural disasters or terrorism, like 9/11 or Hurricane Sandy would be examples of that. But in this case, we have a global pandemic that we've all been going through over the past 2 years. And so we've all been experiencing that. But what's tricky about collective grief is even though we all went through the same global pandemic, we all experienced it a little bit differently. So you're going to have people who experienced a tremendous amount of loss where, they did lose loved ones. You're going to have other people where maybe they didn't lose loved ones, but they still lost those milestones over the past 2 years, those graduations and weddings and births of babies. And I think when you're thinking about the people who work in schools, it's such an epicenter for collective loss, that loss of learning, the loss of being in the classroom, the loss of feeling safe in your workplace. All of those things kind of bleed into collective loss. So collective loss is interesting because it's about the commonality of what we've all experienced, but also knowing that there's different individual experiences even within that commonality.
Yeah, I agree. I definitely agree. And one of the things that came to mind when you were talking is about about minimizing others' losses, right? For me, I might not have lost a loved one, but I lost out on the opportunity to take my cruise in 2020, right? Yeah. And sometimes I feel like I can't bring that up in certain arenas because it's not taken very seriously.
Yeah.
So how would you say that we should address those losses that don't seem as grand?
Yeah. I mean, loss is still loss is the thing. And I think, two things that when we talk about sort of this like idea of comparing loss, comparative suffering, which is kind of a buzzword that you might hear around that idea of like, well, and, yes, this was hard for me, but so-and-so has it worse. All right, well, we're always going to be able to find someone who has it worse or who has it better for us. Loss is loss and grief is grief. And I think our real goal is to be able to honor our own losses while also honoring other people's losses and not necessarily – I mean, it is about scale, right? And I don't think, Selma, that you're ever suggesting like, well, I didn't get to go on a cruise and that's like the same scale as you when you like lost your grandmother or something at all. But it's still a loss. Right? And we've all had those. And I think often in society, like when you're thinking about loss and grief, we really focus on primary losses. So that's like if someone dies. But we don't talk as much about like those secondary losses, those things like losing income, losing a job, not getting to go on a cruise, missing a child's graduation, a kid who doesn't get prom. Those are all losses.
Right. And so as educators, which was our primary audience here, that are struggling with their own feelings around grief and loss, and also having to now present in front of students who are also struggling. What are some good tips that they can use to balance both?
I mean, I think that it's really educators have been put in such a hard spot. They've kind of been like the frontline workers of this pandemic. If you're not a medical worker, this is as frontline as you can be, because these are folks who have been back in the classroom, they've been back in the workplace, they've been masking, they've been turned into safety monitors for kids. It's really challenging. So they have a lot of, I think, probably professional loss as well as a lot of personal loss. And I actually think one of my biggest tips is to build a lot of boundaries around that professional life. So not taking that work home, making sure that they are carving out enough time for themselves so that when they're off the clock, so to speak, you can actually work through this loss. So I think my number one tip is honoring the loss, naming the grief and honoring it, naming the emotions associated with it. So identifying, here is what I lost, whether that's a cruise or a death or, whatever it is, naming it, and then really thinking about the emotions that brings up. And then figuring out what to do with those emotions. So for some people, that might look like journaling. For some people, that might look like therapy. For some people, it might look like organizing some sort of an event to honor a loved one. I think self-care is so huge for teachers, always, for educators, always, for those in the helping professions, always. And when I say self-care, I really mean thinking about taking care of your body in a way that you're getting enough sleep, eating nutritiously and well, maybe cutting down on the Netflix and chill a little.
So binge watching Netflix is not self-care.
I mean, I binge watched Netflix last night. And maybe ate some chocolate, and then I was like, oh, if I'd just gone to bed at 10:30, I wouldn't have done all of those things. I'm not going to tell anyone not to Netflix and chill a little bit, but I am going to say that that's a form of numbing, and so when we're doing it over and over again, we're not engaging in those things that are actually going to bring us more joy and more self-care.
So I think maybe presenting some intention around that Netflix and chill could be helpful, right? It gives us an outlet and an avenue to engage in that, behavior that we need sometimes, Netflix and chill, but also having some boundaries around it that make it intentional.
Perfect. Like I actually like to schedule a Netflix and chill night.
Oh.
Right. So then like you've built it in, but then you're also making sure that you're carving out time for that other stuff.
Mm-hmm. So a couple things that I wanted to say. You mentioned earlier about this global pandemic and how it impacted everyone, whether it's the cruise that Selma didn't go on, which, by the way, I did just go on one about a few weeks ago. So I'm taking my self-care moment seriously, and seriously, I think it's so important for us, the way we look at natural disasters or a global pandemic, where we had Sandy and it devastated so many places on the East Coast. We always rebuild. Yeah. And when it comes to mental health, it's seen differently. So there's physical structures that, okay, the house went down, FEMA comes in and saves us after a while. You get it built up. And when it comes to mental health, I think the work that you're doing, the work that we're championing at MAP, I think is so important for our kids, for our adults, because I think it's part of that work. It's step by step, like scaffolding, building up our emotional intelligence back. Folks have lost that. Some never had it. So now getting to that space to identify, people that are in need. We have people literally screaming for help. And I think one of the frustrations is matching those people with available providers. So the work that you're doing in advocating, I'm thankful for it, and I'm hoping that you continue to partner with us so that we can get better at what we do to offer more for our members and for the society as a whole.
Yeah. Totally agree.
Well, I think you guys are doing such valuable work and just thinking about this and honoring your members with it. And I think one of maybe the things that I'm hopeful about with the pandemic is that it has made it much more okay to say, I'm not okay. I am experiencing depression and anxiety. People do need childcare. Schools are really important in like all of these ways that don't have to do with education. And so, I mean, I'm kind of crossing my fingers that maybe we'll move into a world where we honor self-care more, where people aren't, just on the clock all the time, and where we think more about like what educators need and what kids need and all of those things.
And we can actually take a mental health day and call it that.
Yes, and we can actually say, I'm going to my therapy appointment and not be judged about it, right? Or just to be able to say, oh, I'm depressed, and not have someone think, oh, well, what's wrong with you?
When our parents were tasked with having to now be a crutch or an assistive tool for students on devices or whatever, I can't tell you how many parents were not only teachers but also had to then juggle two roles. I'm helping my kid out with this stupid Zoom or Teams or Google Classroom, and I can't figure this stuff out. It was a challenge for a lot of people. As a matter of fact, that's something that I hear from members who struggled with technology, who weren't used to having to go on all these different sites and log on to this, create this, including me. I'm like, breakout room, what? How you figure? Send me the code all over again. So I know that that's something that I think we also have learned that we've evolved. So there's a transition. There's hybrids now. You go outside on Broadway now, just looking at so many businesses that all shuttered.
Yeah.
That's a reminder for me. So that's triggering even for me. Like, when I heard the mask mandate being loosened and lifted, it gave me a sense of going back to somewhat normalcy. So that's what I'm looking for us, and also for us with mental health, not to go back to what it was before, to evolve in that space.
Yeah.
I think we don't want to embrace that idea of toxic positivity, but there is beauty in grief, right? There is something good that can come out of it.
Yeah.
So and I guess my question would be, how do we effectively move on and grow from the grief, if that's even a thing, while still honoring what we lost, right?
Yeah. So I think, one of our challenges as we move on is to carry the grief with us, but also continue to build our lives around it so that we're always sort of carrying that. And I talked a little bit earlier about how the grief that society kind of thinks about is the Kubler-Ross model, where we have these 5 stages and you get through them and you get through grief and it's resolved, and then you kind of move about your life. And it's not to knock it. It's actually a really useful model when you think about what it was developed for, which were patients with terminal illnesses. But for the rest of us who have life ahead of us and we're having to actually figure out, how do I go through the rest of my life with these losses? It's more about thinking about it as not so much that it's going to get smaller or you're going to get through it, as more like you're going to have more life. And so you're going to carry the sorrow with you even as you continue to have joy. Now, where that kind of shuts down is if you kind of get locked into the trap of just sort of numbing the sorrow, like not being able to identify it, not being able to identify those feelings that you see. You then also numb yourself to the joy. So it's kind of a catch-22. If you don't let yourself actually mourn, if you don't let yourself actually grieve, if you can't actually identify the emotions, then you also can't have the goodness. And then I think it also shuts down your compassion to other people.
I like that concept, because most times you're told just get over it, right? Like move like it doesn't even exist. But what you're saying is carrying it with you, learning how to feel and experience it while also experiencing your life.
Exactly.
Which is something that it's very hard to do without a therapist or a support group.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we're often taught well how to do it, right? In our society, we're often just told, well, put on a happy face. And I was actually listening to a podcast with Susan David, who's this phenomenal psychologist researcher who does a lot of work on toxic positivity. And she was saying that she recently did this research where they asked people to name emotions, and most people could only name 3 emotions: happy, sad, and pissed. Those were the emotions.
Sounds about right. Sounds about right.
Right? So, being able to carry grief with you while also experiencing joy requires that you feel some maybe more emotions than those 3.
Yeah, I go back to the movie. Oh my goodness, what's the name of it?
Inside Out.
Inside Out.
That's one of my favorites.
Sadness was so important, right?
So important.
And throughout the whole movie, I'm like, get her out of here. What is the point, right? She is bringing everybody down. But without sadness, you really can't understand or experience the joy. You just can't.
And I think our cultural differences on how folks grieve are so important. You go to New Orleans, they're partying in the street with the coffin. There's different places that in different regions around the world that they grieve differently. And I think about United States, what makes us different is for the Department of Ed or UFT, they literally look at it on a basis of how close you are related to the deceased.
Degree.
So just imagine that if it's a grandmother, it's 1 day. If it's a spouse or a kid, it might be 3 days. And then they're telling you, and I say this to members when we're on grief all the time because they've challenged themselves to go back into work and they're not ready. And they're saying, I only got 3 days and my husband just died. And that's a hard pill to swallow because you either take a leave of absence with no pay, and then maybe your income is dependent on making ends
meet. So it's
meet.
the losses just cascade.
So that's been something that I would love if they could put legislation in somewhere just to give us a little longer. I know in Europe they definitely do a better job with giving a little bit more time for folks to really deal with the grief to some degree instead of going, okay, right back. If you're not ready to go back, then take a leave of absence.
You've got 72 hours to grieve.
72 hours to grieve the person who you've spent 20 years with. Which is...
Well, and that's a loss that's even just acknowledged. And then when you think about the losses that are unacknowledged, the things that people don't see, the things like miscarriage or a child with a disability or a parent with dementia or any of all of those things, a beloved principal, right? So, and that's actually what's known as ambiguous losses, those losses that aren't easily quantifiable where maybe you have that physical presence but a psychological absence. And those are things that we don't even see as a society. But people, pets are a big one.
We've had a few members definitely jump on the grief and loss group for loss of pets, and it is serious. And some people, it all depends on who you are too. Some people who maybe not attached to animals and not animal lovers, they may not take it. They don't get it.
But it's real, and especially for people maybe if they don't have a partner but they have a dog, that dog is so important to them.
And I think that goes back to what you were saying about comparing the losses, right? Because just because I didn't lose a human being doesn't mean I can't understand that feeling of grief.
Exactly.
And what that means to me.
Yeah, exactly. So ideally, we would use our experience with loss to inform our compassion for people.
It's funny because everyone experiences loss at some point in their life, right? I don't remember who it is that said, it's a very famous quote, the only things that are guaranteed in life are death and taxes.
Take your taxes, please.
I know. And so loss and grief is something that everyone in life experiences at one point in their life. And there's still so much taboo around it, and there's different cultures that celebrate it in different ways, and there's so many ways that we express it. But when it comes to expressing it, there's still a lot of people are still afraid because it is such a hard thing to process, because it is so layered, because there is the ambiguity that comes along with it too, and it's such a significant change in our lives that it's hard to go through all of it, and to go through it alone is impossible.
Yeah.
Right. And so going back to what we were talking about with sadness, right, and how feeling sadness and understanding these emotions are so important because you can't feel the joy. And I'm thinking back about the movie, right? What you saw in the movie of Inside Out is sadness, right, by the main character allowing herself to feel sadness and express it. It brought forward this community that then circled around her and helped her to feel the joy and acknowledge the joy and recognize that again, right? And so I know a lot of times with loss, it's easy to isolate and it's easy to stay closed in, but expressing that, having people, finding someone that you can express this loss with. In groups, in support groups with a therapist, with a good friend, and also understanding that not everyone is going to be able to hold that space for your loss, right?
I think knowing the people who might be able to hold it is really crucial.
Yeah, and allowing yourself to be a little vulnerable and go there and express those emotions, those hard, difficult emotions, can really bring forward a community that can then support you. Or it can bring Alain to your school building.
I got you, members. I got you covered. I definitely take enormous pride in helping our members out, meeting them in the most vulnerable times that they could be in when there's a member of the school community that's passed. Usually one of the most challenging days. Even for me, you mentioned something early in the conversation, going back to self-care, and even through the pandemic, I put on a couple pounds like others did as well, and finding comfort in food and being at home and jumping in and out of the fridges right around for me, and I've lost about 11 of them, and I'm working. Yes, yep. And so my fitted suits no longer were fitted suits; they were just ripping. So I'm definitely back on track in terms of not allowing that to be the thing. I think what's frustrating me throughout all these losses and just in general with the pandemic, the default response is the pandemic. So folks are still stuck in that space where they don't want to climb out of the reality that we are going to move forward. Yeah. And it's just like the same example about the quantifying who's related to who and how long you could take off. It's the same thing even with this is like, guys, we're going to move forward. Yeah. So you're either going to come with us or, and that's what's frustrating is for people to get back to those routines, to start eating healthy, to spending time on self-care, and folks who may not have returned to a space anymore, getting used to that new norm.
Yeah.
Right?
I think it's going to be
working from home.
I think it's going to be really hard. Like, I think where we are now in spring 2022, where it's like, oh, okay, no, I think this really is it, where we try and get back to normal. I think we're sort of all anticipating it's going to be like endless joy and the hills are alive with the sound of music. And I actually think it's going to be really hard. Yeah. I think it's going to be really hard. But I really do think that when we allow people the space to like name what we've lost, to name those emotions, well, I feel really scared about this. This feels really uncomfortable. This feels really hard. I think that is how people are then able to kind of like start to take those steps.
Alana, we talked about you showing up in schools. Mm-hmm. So can you talk a little bit about that? Like, what is the purpose of that?
So we are part of all of us under the umbrella, part of the Health and Safety Department for the United Federation of Teachers. And we have social workers that work with MAP, but also during the day, during school hours from 8 to 3 p.m., we support schools throughout crisis situations. For example, there was an unfortunate fire that took place in the Bronx that we lost a lot of students this year. Probably my most challenging week of my career in terms of this work was that week. And we were there. We showed up every day, myself or my colleague. We provided support. So we do a lot of individual stuff. We talk to the large staff group as well, just offering supports. We always recommend MAP support as well. We're there for grief counseling, so we sit in a private space if they have it provided. With COVID, it's been more challenging. And we let members come in and express whatever it is that they want. I've had members come in and sit in silence, which is fine as well, but just knowing there's comfort there. I've had schools where we've gone and I haven't seen one person, and the signs on the door or they sent an email out, and I still feel like it was worthwhile because at least they knew that we were there as U of T. And the distinction there's no distinction, rather, of whether you are a U of T member or not. We're there for, when we're in person, we're there for the entire staff. So we could see the principal, the lunchroom staff, a school safety agent, a custodian, which is, I think, which makes our program really, really stand out, because we're there for everyone.
So I think it's a good time to, like, how do people contact you, right? Like, are principals only the people that get in, like?
I get notification from my counterpart, Mary Shaman, from Department of Ed. She is the director of crisis, so she's my counterpart DOE-wide. She's citywide as well, so she communicates me. If she receives notification of a passing of a community member, she sends me a notification. The chapter leaders of the respective schools sometimes find out first as well. They reach out to us, and then we start to assess whether or not they need supports. In some cases, depending on how long the person's been out, if it was a long illness, if it was something sudden, they usually hit our folks a little harder. If the person was there on Thursday and Thursday night, they don't. I mean, Friday morning they don't wake up. We've had a lot of those. Those are the ones I think that I experienced with myself with a friend of mine, the principal that passed away on Staten Island. That was an enormous loss, 49, and saying he was going to work. And his family's there. His wife's a U of T teacher as well. His son goes to the school. So it was a pretty significant loss for the school community, very well liked, and he had a heart attack on the way to work. You know, so those are the ones that, even in the work that I do, I'm human, and this one hit me because I was friends with him. You know, so I think for us, even for me, as I visit schools, I say this to members all the time. As much as you believe I'm here for you, which I'm physically here for you, you guys are helping me go through my own grief, and I think we're doing it as a team. So it's almost like an informal grief group that they don't know that I'm here to help them, but they're here to help me too. So every once in a while, as a human, I'm boohooing too. It's just part of it, and I go through a whole process prior to going to a school. I have to circle the block twice and listen to music and get myself prepared for what I'm gonna hear and see. So depending on the school, I think your responses to the grief and to the loss are different, and it varies. But I'm citywide. Folks can reach out to the U of T, Metellus at uoft.org. We also have information how to reach us on MAP as well. So we are available. Hopefully, I don't have to see members in that space, but if we do need to, we are there citywide.
We know that it's a part of life. It's a part of life, right? And so, as much as we don't want to experience these things, they're going to come. And
I take pride in it.
Yeah, we're grateful that this program exists, Alain, that you're showing up with your humanity, right? Because I think that is the most important thing. If you never run a session, to just know that there is a human being that is there that can take the shots. You can come in and yell, scream, and do whatever you need to do for a allotted period of time, and be able to go back and pick up the pieces and try to do the work that you do. Mm-hmm. We're all helping professionals, right? Like teachers, social workers, whether you're school psychologists, principals, administration. We're in a helping profession, and that can be very overwhelming stress. And so I think you alluded to, doing what you need to do to get yourself together for that, in that moment. Riding around the block, listening to your music, whatever it is, listening to a guided meditation on your phone, like having these things readily available, right, to prepare you to make it through. Because after your 72 hours of grief, we've got to pick it up and get back to life.
Depending on the school environment, I might walk in Brooklyn. I might just scream that out in the middle of the hallway. Excuse me, who was that? I'm with the U of T. Don't be startled. But seriously, I think the work that we're doing and we continue to do, we want to just grow it, and we want folks to reach out. Reach out. If you're struggling with anything, we have confidential spaces for you to talk. I just think that it's so important. It's probably like the thing I walk around with the most. If you need somebody to talk to, we're there. We're available. And if you don't feel comfortable talking to someone at the U of T, we can definitely help out with recommendations and referrals.
I had a question for you, Ashley. If you can so Selma asked a question about, as an educator, dealing with personal feelings. and loss. How do you balance both, right? And you pointed out to setting boundaries around professional, right? Once you leave the building, once the work is done, make sure that you make that time for yourself. Yeah. When members are in the classroom, right, and you also share that ambiguous loss is something that we're all experiencing, especially our students too. Mm-hmm. And what can educators do to support students in the classroom, right? And it's going to look different. Yeah. Elementary school, pre-K, high school, middle school.
Such a range of it. I mean, I think, and it's hard because I think, educators are there to educate. But when I envision it, I would say for like those kids who are like more like the middle school, high school age, like you can straight up say to those kinds of kids, well, like, what have you guys lost? What have you guys lost in giving them that space? I remember when I was in high school, I had this teacher. He was a debate teacher. And on Fridays, we didn't do debate. We like sat around and kind of did this, like he would like ask us different questions and we would like all go around and answer them. And when I think about my high school experience, that was actually one of like the most formative things that I ever had, was getting to hear the experiences of all these different kids. Like I didn't really know most of them. And you don't necessarily have to carve out that space every Fridays, but I think that there is something to be said for taking that opportunity, especially if things are like a little restive or kids are kind of having a hard time, to be able to say like, what have you guys lost? Mm-hmm. And like asking as a teacher, like, what can I learn from you? Like, what do you guys think that us adults need to know? Can be a really powerful intervention. I also think interventions like making sure that there's space for like deep breathing and movement is super helpful for kids, even if they're not specifically like naming those things. I think so much of us carry tension in our bodies. So when you create that space just to be like, you know what, we're all going to get up and we're going to do a stretch and we're going to all like take 5 deep breaths, can be really, really helpful. And then for those younger kids, the younger kids are always a little bit trickier because they tend not to be, they're not like intellectualizing things in the same ways, but I think movement for young kids is really helpful as well. I think routine, structure, helping them feel safe in their classrooms is huge. And I also think kids like will surprise you. Like if you ask them like what COVID is about, you'll get a variety of answers, right? So my kids will say, well, like we have to wear masks everywhere, but they also really love that my husband and I actually worked from home. We hated it, but like they were around all the time, So I don't know. I don't feel like I have like a really solid answer on the younger kids. But I guess what I would say about younger kids is we often think that they aren't taking everything in. And I want to be really clear that they can have as profound of a response to grief as adults. They might not identify those secondary losses in the same way. But I think especially for young kids, allowing them access to things like art, physical movement, and music and storytelling is actually where you're going to see it come out. Mm-hmm. So it's going to be less about like asking them, well, what have you lost, but really like thinking about their play. And so like if you're in a school that has access to that kind of programming, I would really be thinking about like, well, what are the stories that maybe we can tell in drama, or what are the songs we can sing that kind of access that. Does that make sense?
Yeah. All of the above I've seen at the various schools with our young people and social workers coming from the DOE side, because we handle staff. They usually have with the younger kids where they'll write something about the student that they lost. They'll draw a picture. Where they find safe places for them to go to. It's really surprising. The kids sometimes are more resilient than the adults are.
Yeah. There's something to be said for that, right?
Yeah. One practice that I do with my own kids, right, because they're all in different grade levels and buildings, like who's your person, right? And that can be, it could be the janitor, right? Like who do you connect with that you can go to and say, hey, I'm struggling, right? It doesn't have to be your teacher, even though that's the person that you see most. It could be anyone that's identified in that building that can give you some kind of support, and also encouraging those auxiliary staff and maintenance, all the other people that you don't necessarily look at as an educator, as a part of that community, and how you can create safe spaces for anyone, whether it's other staff or the students themselves.
Yeah.
I also really I do this thing with my kids, and I have had other people do it, where I always ask them 3 questions. What was your favorite part about today? What did you not like about today? And then I usually ask them what they're grateful for. And I think it's actually really useful. Like, you can revise the 3 questions in a variety of ways, but like, tell me something about the past 2 years that's been good. Tell me something you didn't like about school this year. Tell me something you did like about school. What's something about school that's made you happy? You know, like, those are all kind of ways to access into their world. And kids really surprise you with the stuff that they say when you kind of get into those questions. But I think allowing them to have that capacity to say, well, here's this thing I did like about it that was good, and here's this thing that I also really didn't, is an important skill so that they can learn it's both, right? It can be both at the same time.
I like that you said also, like, just checking in with students, right? Just being like, how are you doing, right? Or how are things going? And that made me think of, so I had an experience when I was in 4th grade where my family experienced a significant number of losses that were pretty consecutive. And my 4th grade teacher, I will never, ever, ever forget her, especially for this moment, Mrs. Jacovitis. Teachers are important. And she just took me out, like, stopped me on my way out of the school building one day. And she was just like, I saw in the paper that there's been a lot happening with your family, for, I think, saw obituaries or whatever. And she was just like, how are you doing? And I mean, I was in 4th grade. At the time, I didn't really have words. I was just like, I'm fine. And like, I don't know. I couldn't connect with those emotions and put words to the emotions at the time. But even still to this day, just the fact that she took a moment to stop and ask me how I was doing meant the world. And it still, and even at this age, I'm not going to say how old I am, but as a careered person, with a family of her own, I still remember that.
Thank you for sharing that. And I wanted to add to that. I think the work that's important to me is us setting an environment like that where if you make it second nature, where kids just know you're investing in me, you care about me, you're asking me questions like that, not just after something happened, but the proactive work. I think that's what's important. It's not just, okay, we lost someone in the school community. What are we doing leading up to that? That way, when something like that happens, human nature is going to kick in. People's responses are going to still be what they are, but they'll feel more comfortable going, the school's already set for this. They already have spaces. I've visited schools, which I find remarkable, that they're just setting up spaces like a room that we're in now, where they're almost like mindfulness rooms, and they're rooms where you can go in and just go and just unwind, or you're going through something. And I think for teachers and kids. So I think it's important for that work so that you're not playing behind instead of getting ahead of making sure kids feel comfortable.
And I also think the checking in with the kid or the teacher who actually looks really good is important. Those people who look really good and seem to be doing really well sometimes don't get the attention they deserve. You know what I mean? And then it falls apart really hard for them. So I think never assuming that just because someone seems like they're doing okay that they are.
Thank you, Ashley and Alain, for being here and for sharing some of your experience and your knowledge with us. Everything that you shared with us are things that our members and listeners will benefit from significantly.
So, Ashley, where can people reach you?
You can reach me at my website. I have a website, www.ashleygroesbecktherapy.com. That's ASHLEYGROESBECK therapy.com. And you can email me through that. And I have a blog that feels so retro. But that's where you can find me.
Awesome. Alain, any closing word? I want to thank Ashley. I want to thank our great co-host, and hopefully this show goes nationally syndicated. That's what I'm pushing for. Bank on it now, ladies and gentlemen. But seriously, thank you guys for having us be a part of this. Ashley, I learned so much from you. I would like to continue to partner with you and get best practices and all the fun stuff that you do, and spread the word, of course. So thank you guys for having us.
It's always a pleasure to be with you.
Once again, thank you for joining us for this episode of the Classroom Café. If you are a UFT member, the Members Assistance Program can be reached at 212-701-9620 or at mapinfo@uft.org.